I can teach you the grammar of Farsi in an afternoon, basically,
You
as we did.
Yes, we did that. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Abbasid History Podcast. The study of pre-modern Islamic history requires a mastery of classical Arabic to analyse many of the primary sources. According to Foreign Service Institute, the body responsible for training American diplomats and other governmental staff abroad, Arabic is a Category 5 language, which is their ranking for the hardest to learn, along with Japanese, Korean, and Cantonese and Mandarin, requiring 88 weeks, which is 2,200 hours, to achieve what they call general professional proficiency in both speaking and reading. Anecdotally, the experience of college and university students on both sides of the Atlantic in learning Arabic is not a positive one. Here at the SOAS radio recording studio, to educate new and intermediate students how to excel in the Arabic language is an illustrious SOAS alumni, an author of Master Arabic, language learning coach and researcher of the modern Middle East, Dr. Alex Strick von Linschkoten. Welcome, Dr. Strick von Linschkoten.
Thank you for having me.
In a recent article in the Michigan Daily, Ms. Ibtihal Makki criticized how the Al-Kitab textbook taught the word United Nations in Chapter 1 before life and hobby in Chapter 6, and that the whole tone was a politicized approach rather than cultural. Both me and you have studied Arabic here at SOAS through the Owen Wright series, which at that time I used to refer to as a green book because of its plain green cover. And it was a very linguistics-heavy textbook. And having spoken to some of the teachers here as well, I know they would like to revise the entire program if they had the chance. What do you feel have been the major shortcomings in how Arabic is taught today?
I think that the one of the reasons why Arabic tuition is the way it is because of what universities and their departments perceive as the need, and essentially they feel like they're delivering the program that the market demands to some extent, which is why you end up with so much focus on newspaper articles, basically, and being able to understand Al Jazeera or participate in a debate on Al Jazeera, and it's also why you have less need for basic communication ability, because essentially you're not going to deliver in your life as a diplomat for the Foreign Office with good colloquial Arabic. Basically, you need some kind of higher level or higher standard, and so that's kind of why we've ended up where we are, I feel. And there are all sorts of shortcomings with that approach. I could talk quite extensively, I guess, with what I feel were ways where I felt somehow let down by the program which I'd kind of studied at SOAS. But ultimately, the biggest thing for me, the biggest shortcoming, is that often Arabic language programs teach you to be somehow dependent on the institution or the teachers that you're studying with. And in the years since I studied Arabic formally at university, I've kind of liberated is too strong a word, but tried to find ways of being less dependent on those programs and institutions and so on.
You also studied Persian here, and I imagine Persian also, the teaching of Persian also has those kind of same problems that we're describing in the teaching of Arabic.
Actually not.
Okay.
I mean, there was much more of a balanced emphasis in. I have a BA in Arabic and Farsi, and just because of, I'm not exactly sure why, but you are given and are expected to take more units in Arabic than you are in Farsi, probably because it's grade 5 language, but the department was smaller, and so you had a far more flexible approach to how it was taught, and it was far more flexible. And well, for me, also during that time, I started traveling a lot to Afghanistan, so that helped get me more of a balance between the kind of the formal study. But also Arabic and Farsi are very different beasts as languages, as I think you know.
And we'll get to how the student of Arabic language then proceeds to learning Persian as part of analysing the sources of early Islam. Let's move on. Arguably, there is no need to enroll in expensive and unengaging classes to learn Arabic or any other language. One can find many examples of self-sufficient learning methods in the works of certain celebrity polyglots, some of whom you've interviewed in your Sources and Methods podcast. What do you think they are doing that makes classes almost redundant?
Well, I mean, the first thing they're doing is they're just challenging the expectation that you need someone to teach you something. And I mean, you do need someone or something. You do need kind of input, but the idea that you can only get that input and you can only get that structure through a formal system, I think, is just at the very least it should kind of be heavily scrutinized nowadays. And it's not just a question of the money, and which universities, at least in the UK, aren't quite as bad as they are in the US, for example. But even kind of immersion programs, the kind of prime immersion program in at least the kind of the Western world is the Middlebury Summer Language Course, and essentially you're expected to come up with $15,000 or $20,000 to attend that, unless you get a scholarship. And you don't need that. And we're lucky that Arabic now increasingly has kind of good materials for kind of beginning to intermediate levels. Obviously, at the advanced levels, you can go as far as you want, but in order to reach that level, you do need some kind of transition materials. And there are more and more of those available. There's been a kind of democratization of the kinds of skills you need to be able to be a self-studying language learner. And there are also lots of models of people who have done that and who are kind of openly available, and they publish their methods and their experiences on their blogs or podcasts or on YouTube or whatever. So a mix of the models and the methods and the materials really, I kind of, my approach now is, why would you go and take some pure language, unless you want to go into academia or something, which is increasingly a risky proposition. But unless you really want that, I don't see that there should be a reason why someone would take like a pure languages degree. You can do that on the side while you get your economics or whatever else it is you're interested in studying.
I feel we both have experiences that we can pass on to new learners of languages and help them avoid some of the mistakes, often costly ones, that we made. You've written about your time in the immersion program. To tell me more about that, what you felt were its advantages at least, but why you felt that it ultimately didn't deliver the totality of what it ought to.
Well, I mean, this particular immersion program is interested in the kind of the more formal side of the language, and it's very much part of the, I don't know how to, kind of Arabo-linguistic complex or something, where the only standard of achievement, I guess, is being able to, understand fairly dense novels, which in some world I can understand how that is a standard, but for many people that's not a standard where they feel they need to achieve, or it's not something that they need to work on, or it's not useful for them. So there are lots of different levels there. There are people who are coming in for without any knowledge at all, and that program does feel like a waste if you're going to spend your first month on this incredibly expensive program just like figuring out how to learn the alphabet. Like that's something you can do on your own. You don't need to have your hand held for that. But at the higher levels, the advantages were just 2 months where you've kind of cast away all of the other little bits of your life, and you get to focus on mastering something or working really hard to the focus of one particular thing. And it's almost, could be anything you want it to be. If you spend 2 months focusing on anything exclusively and with complete immersion, you're going to make progress in it. So for me, it was important because it came at a time where I neglected my Arabic for almost 10 years while I was in Afghanistan, and I needed to revive it. So it was the most time efficient way, and I happened to get a scholarship.
Let's look into how you would advise people to at least start as beginners. Where would you advise they start before they reach this intermediate level, which your book, Master Arabic, addresses?
I think before every person who comes to Arabic has their own reasons for doing it. So, if someone wants to work out in the world, then I would say the key thing or the important thing is to pick your dialect and kind of focus on that like quite extensively. If someone wants to go into academia and wants to be able to look at things from a historical perspective, or even someone who wants to kind of deepen their religious studies, all of these things necessitate different approaches, and being clear about that up front is really important. But for someone who's starting completely afresh, above all, the thing which I think is important, to mention to people is that learning the alphabet should not be seen as this huge mountain that often it is. I'm not sure how it was when you came and you were studying here at SOAS, but when I came in the mid 2000s, we were essentially told learn the alphabet before week 1, and we'll start from there. So it was not even seen as a step on the, and if you have that expectation, I think you can move past it far quicker. Whereas if you feel like it's this mountain, then you can I've seen people spend months on it, just like working laboriously through each letter and so on. So learn the alphabet because it'll open up a universe of resources and materials to you. And also I feel like you can't properly master kind of pronunciation and that kind of things if you're dealing with translations. And then choose your materials and resources widely. There's a number of kind of best practices around language learning which can enable you to kind of get off the beginning level and into the lower intermediate level really quickly. And I think having some kind of approach where you tackle like very frequently used words, I think is pretty important early on, because then that gives you some materials with which to work. So those two things I think would be very basic kind of starting points.
Allow me to linger longer on the motivations of the beginner learner and their approaches before we get to the intermediate plateau, which your book addresses. I always felt something that was missing, at least from SOAS, was teaching people handwriting. I feel that handwriting is an important tool in that language, right? And it's quite unfortunate that you see people even at the end of the second year, before they're sent for their year abroad, who are writing in a way which is they're copying the letters, how they think the letters should be written, instead of knowing how to write them properly. And for me, in my experience, doing some tutoring in the Arabic language whilst I was doing my master's, I always wanted to make people self-sufficient. And I felt that teaching them correct handwriting was part of that. And also how to type and text in Arabic, because that's our primary means of import in this day and age as well. And that familiarizes them with certain idiosyncrasies of the Arabic alphabet and certain nuances which even native speakers can make mistakes on, regarding the Hamza and so on. Would there be particular books that you would recommend new learners to start with?
So on the writing aspect, there is actually one book which we've had some kind of correspondence about in the past. You very helpfully kind of sent me some scans of one book. I think it's called Modern. It's called something very generic, like Modern Arabic or Modern Literary Arabic. I'll get you the title for the show notes. But
you just implicated me in piracy, so I would like to. I'm neither affirm or deny that.
I think it's sufficiently old that it's no longer under copyright.
Okay.
I think so.
So the Mitchell book?
Yes, yeah. I think it was from the 20s to the 30s. In any case, that book is the only book which I found which deals with the kind of the topic of handwriting. And it's a pity, you're right, it's a pity that people aren't taught this as part of their programs. I think programs like SOAS assume they assume two things. They assume that handwriting, you'll pick it up along the way. They assume that you'll pick up colloquial along the way. I mean, they're both fairly big things, the latter obviously bigger than the former, to assume that people would pick up in like a program where you're supposed to be formally structuring someone's study in a topic. So that is kind of more or less the only resource I think for handwriting. And in my experience, native speakers aren't very good at teaching handwriting. You need a kind of a more systematic approach. So that would be where I would start with that. Typing, you're completely right. And in fact, I probably would put that in my list of the early things. Once someone's mastered the alphabet a bit, it's a little bit like touch typing on a computer nowadays, where that to my mind is a kind of a basic step of literacy. If you can't type, maybe not as fast as the speed of your thoughts in your mind, but if you can't approach that, you're really, you're tying your leg or tying your arm behind your back or whatever. You're hampering your ability to interact with the world, basically. And it's especially given that you're going to spend hundreds, thousands of hours learning Arabic, taking I would say it doesn't take probably more than 20 or 30 hours, putting in that investment early on to really be able to like type properly in Arabic. It's kind of a tiny amount of time, and it pays so many dividends for your just ability to send letters to people, to write, and so much of communication now is digital, and particularly if you're a self-studying language learner, your teachers are going to be in the Arab-speaking world. They're going to be far away. It's not like you're going to be together with the teacher and you can send and you're giving them your handwritten pieces of paper. I do have students that I work with in the beginning who they'll send a photo of a handwritten thing, but the sooner you can get into typing and digital ways of communication, you just open up this huge world for yourself. There is my go-to recommendation for that used to be something called Aktub, aktub.com, I think. I'm not sure if it still exists, but there are good kind of native programs for Windows and Mac and Linux and stuff. So there and free stuff available. There's a lot available online, and yeah, I very strongly recommend that someone takes that time to do it. Just like half an hour a day or something.
I mean, if I was to recommend to a new learner how to go about learning Arabic themselves, I would say start with the Jane Whitewick and Mahmoud Ghaffar Mastering Arabic book by Macmillan and Palgrave. And then I would say move on to Haywood and Ahmed.
Your favourite.
and then I think if I would also use the internet to use italki and these kind of resources to find a native speaker to get your pronunciation right, which is so important for your confidence, and to kind of consolidate what you can't do via textbooks and online forums. That would be my advice on that. Do you have anything to add to that before we get to your book?
On pronunciation, I would echo the importance of that. And the one piece of advice which actually my brother gave me, because he'd been through the SOAS program, and very early on, he told me, kind of a two-part piece of advice. Firstly, really, don't be lazy with pronunciation, because the habits that you make early on will continue to haunt you for the rest of your life. So, really put the effort in early on. And then secondly, since pronunciation is so much of you're teaching your muscles how to to kind of get round these new syllables, or sometimes old syllables, but in new contexts. In the beginning, it'll feel very strange to pronounce some of these sounds. So you can feel okay with exaggerating them early on. And luckily, we had some kind of good teachers at SOAS who weren't afraid of kind of making themselves look stupid by having kind of ridiculous pronunciations of some of the different syllables and so on. But by doing that, you can then relax into what's normal. Whereas if you don't slightly exaggerate it and kind of go a bit over the top, I feel like you'll always have this slightly uncertain pronunciation. And it is so important to even just, the moment you open your mouth and you say one word in the Arabic speaking world, someone will judge you from that first syllable. And if your first syllable is a kind of Americanized sounding thing, then people will feel like they need to modulate their language back to you and so on. So it gives all sorts of cues that you can avoid if you just put in that extra effort early on.
So your book, Master Arabic, we've described some of the problems out there, and clearly your book is there to remedy that, and particularly for the intermediate Arabic learner. Tell us about the motivations behind writing your book. What do you feel it contributed?
So I do work as a language coach, is how I kind of frame it, and I work with a lot of people who want to study. In particular, I have a kind of a niche for myself in Arabic, Farsi, and Pashto. But I kind of work with people with lots of different languages. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to put together a book that would be able to give some kind of offer the kinds of things that I tell people and talk to them about when I'm working as working with them one-on-one, but just have kind of a lot of the best practices all in one place. And it was also, because I see lots of people who come out of a 3-4 year language degree. Either they come fresh out of it or they've been away for 10 years or something like myself. And they have a lot of the building blocks and they've devoted a lot of time and they have this great reserve of passive vocabulary, usually in this media field, and they're, from their university studies, but who mostly people come and they realize that they can't speak or they can't interact in the world and, around them. That's kind of usually the first place. But then, then it's just, they realize that they're able to do things at a certain level, but it's not good enough to be able to read novels or whatever else it is. So I think, there's this whole, and for years there weren't really textbooks or resources geared at this intermediate level. It was just assumed that people would only be studying Arabic at this beginner level, get them to the point where they can read a newspaper article, have learned the alphabet, can say some basic things, but actually aren't really road ready to, if they took a step in Cairo or Damascus or wherever, and they open their mouth, like immediately you can tell that you can't say that you've mastered the language, because people would look at you strangely or even give them some text or something, which, people would really struggle with. And so I wanted to give people the resources to be able to tackle this on their own without needing to necessarily go into some kind of deep language program and kind of withdraw from whatever else it is that they were doing, their professional vocation.
And not wishing to burst the bubble of any kind of keen, current, successful Arabic student, that feeling of transitioning from learning in a classroom to the first day abroad is not, it can be quite unpleasant and shocking experience. But we're here to provide light to the darkness, not to...
And I would say all of the techniques which I write about, which aren't, great innovations, you can find them, all over the place on the internet. Just kind of gathered them together in one place for my book. All of these things are available to you if you are a first year, student at SOAS or Edinburgh or wherever. And, there's kind of some level of anger that these techniques weren't taught to us early on in our program. Just because I would have benefited so much just from the from the kind of cumulative interest of those things, and from having started early on. I discovered all of these things much later, which I kind of am a bit regretful about, but that's why I'm such a big advocate for them now, because you don't need to wait until you finished your program to supplement your study. And you'll kind of quite quickly be at the top of your class, I think, if you implement a few of these things.
I mean, you'd think students have a sufficient sense of grievance, bitterness, and to add all this on top. I mean, let's move on. So you're very big on productivity, organization, getting things done. And the first couple of chapters in your book are on these things. So how important are those kind of general skills for the study of languages?
I mean, I consider them fundamental in the sense that having your sleep and your diet and some kind of exercise in your life as also being fundamental just to being a human being. And from personal experience, I know that when I neglect those things for whatever reason, if I neglect the fundamentals, then the mind, which we have a tendency to kind of see it as somehow distinct or superior or whatever to the body on which it's its foundation, but you can't do your best work if you're neglecting the fundamentals. And so much of once you have that kind of dialed in, but even if not, so much of the world and the systems in which we live and operate and so on conspire to take us away from our best work and our most kind of productive state. And that's been something which has changed, I felt, as I was growing up, and kind of particularly over the last 10 years or so on. You step one foot on the internet and everything is conspiring to pull you in one direction or the other, and take you away from what it was you originally intended to do. And I feel like you have to take a deliberate step to limit the effects of that system. I maybe there are people out there who have tremendous self-control and wherewithal to be able to withstand it, but I am not that person. I would reckon that probably most people are in that bucket where you need to actively counter those influences rather than just hope you'll get lucky one day.
Let's look at another specific aspect of language learning and how that can be applied to Arabic specifically. So we need to learn vocab. I have a long list in front of me and I'm diligently repeating each item again and again, but nothing is sticking. Why is that?
Well, nothing is sticking because you're approaching it from just one method, and you're only kind of working on using kind of one sense. You're just kind of having the oral feedback loop in your mind, and you're trying to use that to kind of drill it into your head. Luckily, the learning of vocabulary is heavily studied, and it's something for which there are many best practices available, and kind of it's quite easy to kind of turn someone's learning of vocabulary around. I don't know if you'd want me to kind of talk about some kind of best principles around that.
It'd be good to hear some of those.
So first of all, I think kind of foundation is to bring all of your senses into the process. So when you're repeating it, obviously it's good to say it out loud. Some people don't even say it out loud; they're just looking at symbols on a page. So saying it out loud is good because you bring in the muscles in your face, and that's important. But then, if you can find a way to make it visual in some senses, that's, going back to thousands of years, where people had far better memories, or were far more proficient at using their memories, I should say, than people are now. Memorization was a very visual thing, and associating a particular word with the sound and then transforming that sound into an image. So if I can give an example, pick an Arabic word for me, preferably not some kind of like Form 10 abstract word.
Kitab.
Kitab. That's not likely to be a word that people struggle with, but
There's one word which, using those techniques, I still remember how I learned in my first year of Arabic, which was ittahama, which means to accuse someone, to suspect someone or something. Form 8 verb. And the way I memorized that was ittahama sounds like it's a ham. And I pictured myself in our local Marks and Spencers, which existed when I was a boy, and a very vivid sense of the lino floor and the hum of the freezers. And I imagined myself as a security guard there, and I'm walking around and I can hear the soles of my shoes squeaking against the lino, and I hear a rustling sound from behind the freezers. And as I get closer, I can feel the humming of the freezers, and I can feel the temperature dropping. And low in front of me, stealing the food and eating them, is a big ham sandwich with 2 big eyes and a mouth and 2 hands and 2 legs. So ittahama is a ham. And also because the verb is used with a particle, be, I imagine a bee coming and stinging it, giving it instant justice. So that's how I remembered ittahama be. Is that in the right line of?
Yes, exactly. What I would add to that is I would say the more, again, this is going back to how people several thousand years ago remembered things. The more kind of outrageous images and the outrageous kind of scenes that you can imagine, the more memorable it's going to be. So I don't know what you could add to that, but death, shock, horror, humor, all of these kinds of things are.
A talking ham sandwich is pretty vivid enough for me.
Yeah, but it's maybe not kind of shocking. Yeah. So that would be kind of one important thing. And then the other kind of really big game changer, I think, is the idea of spaced repetition, which is a very simple concept, which is, that our memories decay when we don't access them or use them or aren't kind of compelled to remember that ittahama means to accuse someone of something. And if what spaced repetition is, it tells you that there's a certain pattern and frequency of testing yourself, which is the most efficient way to make sure that word ends up in your long-term memory. So instead of, a lot of people use flashcards. They'll have paper or little small bits of card. Instead of reviewing that card for ittahama every day for the rest of your life, actually you can space this out over a fairly kind of well-known schedule. Repeat it after a day, 3 days, a week, a month, several months, and then a year, and so on. And it's kind of an exponentially increasing time frame. And if you do that, you're saving yourselves huge amounts of time, and you're actually making the memory stronger, because you're then testing yourself on at the point where it's just about to be forgotten, which is the best time to learn it in terms of your future recall. And you can manage this manually with kind of boxes and kind of schedules. Again, for people who have learned how to type, there are kind of great pieces of software like Anki, which manage that. I realized that some people are often wary of building in some kind of software system into their life, like Anki, because it's once you're committed to it kind of for the long term then, because for it to serve up the words that you're meant to be studying. But for many people, that is a real game changer, and that is the thing I think that I would have liked to have had from the beginning of my SOAS kind of studies. Most of all is all of that vocabulary that they make you learn, to kind of have that. And I know a lot of people studying Arabic now are using those systems, because you see their online flashcards available in the kind of the internet marketplace, SOAS Book One and so on.
So just to sum up, vocab, spaced repetition, and outrageous, vivid experiences.
Bring in all the senses. Yeah.
So do you think, at least when it comes to the student of early Islam, who really wants to be analysing texts, do you think there's any need for them to master conversational skills or even a dialect?
I think it's important because I guess it depends a little bit what you mean by master. But I think someone who neglects colloquial skills to the point where they can only have a kind of a very stilted Fusha conversation with someone if they were in Cairo or Riyadh or wherever. I think there's no need for that. I would say like it's easy enough to get to a conversational level in a dialect, and it almost doesn't matter what dialect, I guess, but preferably obviously a dialect kind of where you're likely to encounter the people, and unless your passion is North Africa, probably not one of the kind of North African dialects which makes up French into that. But it's important because there's a context to everything, and you're also cutting yourself off from opportunities and possibilities of exchange and dialogue with other people from the regions that you're studying, and your ability to communicate with them. So you may be interested in very early Islamic text or something like that, but let's say you want to talk with another scholar who's working on similar issues. Maybe in email, just maybe you might be able to kind of get away with having a kind of very formal style and dialogue. But really, when scholars are discussing things between themselves, they'll graduate or gravitate towards a style which is slightly less formal, because it allows for a more fluid communication and so on. And you really don't know what you're cutting yourself off from by not knowing colloquial Arabic, and it also it blocks up other opportunities for growth in your professional life, and you may decide that you need X or Y, and so I think it's given that it doesn't take a superhuman amount of extra study or extra effort to be conversational in a dialect. I don't quite understand why people don't.
Okay, so our listener, following our tips in how to begin, they used, as I suggested, the White and Ghafoor book, and then they moved on to Hayward and Ahmed. They used a native speaker via italki to perfect their pronunciation, and perhaps they use the Mitchell book for their handwriting. And then they use your book, Master Arabic, when they're at the intermediate stage. And now they're a very confident student of the Arabic language, and they're analysing texts for early Islam. They also realise they need to learn Persian. So you also being a student of the Persian language, tell us about what the transition is like from Arabic to Persian.
I would say it's a beautiful experience. It coming from, I guess, particularly given how it's taught here at SOAS. I mean, that was my experience, kind of transitioning into Farsi. But really, for anyone, it's the challenge with Farsi is not in the grammar, which perhaps in some way is the challenge with Arabic. Or I'll just leave that where it is for the moment. But the challenge with Farsi really is vocabulary, I would say. And if someone knows the alphabet and has studied Arabic a bit, I can teach you the grammar of Farsi in an afternoon, basically, as we did.
Yes, we did that outside on the bench at SOAS. Yeah.
Exactly. And obviously knowing theoretically how everything functions is not the same as being able to use it, but it just tells you a little bit about this kind of the scale of the challenge. And how does one transition into Farsi? Easily and with pleasure, I would say. You can learn the grammar fairly easily, and then then you're just like diving into texts really. And I always say start with reading, both with Arabic and with Farsi, because it's a medium where you can control the speed at which you intake things rather than listening to something or conversation or TV, because all the parts are moving too fast and you can't really control it. And sometimes you just want to pause and slow things down. And you can do that, I suppose, with speaking and so on, but it's just reading is a far more natural way to do that. And I mean, all the same principles I would say would apply with Farsi. There are some pronunciation idiosyncrasies which you need to transition yourself out of from Arabic.
I guess it throws you when you see three different letters have the same pronunciation in Arabic.
Yeah. But, if you've been studying colloquial, you probably have headed in that direction already. And then, learn some of the more frequent words and try and take a kind of a bit of a functional approach where you're tackling numbers and your ability to navigate streets and have basic conversations and stuff. And then kind of follow your nose, I guess, in terms of what you end up reading and what you end up exposing yourself to. But while it takes, Farsi is deceptive in the ease which you can get to a kind of passing conversational fluency. But the point where you're reading Hafiz and Saadi and so on, and all of those richness of vocabulary and the kind of the sophistication of Persian poetry, that then takes you, probably a similar amount of time as Arabic does to really get into that. But no, it's getting to a kind of basic intermediate level with Farsi. I mean, I don't know what your experience was, but I feel like it was.
I mean, there's a great course here at SOAS by Ms. Farzad, teaching Persian specifically to those who've learned Arabic previously.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very popular class, and she's such a lovely teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I remember for Nowruz, like, she does a little setup on the table and she gives out sweets and all that kind of stuff. And I found the experience a really positive one. It's probably one of the best classes here. And her textbook, I think, is a good starting place. And obviously, we'd recommend listeners to buy it rather than download the scanned PDF that you might be able to find online along with all the audios. So I wasn't sure whether I would have the opportunity to do the course. So the summer previously, I went through her book and I used one of the online language learning forums just to ask questions about things I found difficult, and I uploaded some of my own speaking just to get other people to check my pronunciation, my cadences. That's a great place, I think. The Ms. Farzad's book. I'm not aware of anything.
Well, since she's published her book, there are now a few other materials. There's also a frequency dictionary of Persian which has come out with examples for every word. There's a whole bunch of options for Farsi now. I would say if you're interested in Afghanistan, then I would say probably choose a Dari specific textbook, of which there are a couple, because that'll have implications for you kind of going forward. But no, for Farsi, and there's a good colloquial Persian book with kind of audio and stuff. So there are a whole bunch of options for Farsi.
So your output capacity and ability to reach proficiency in new skills is legendary to those who know you. You went from the violin when you was a child, obviously, to Arabic and Persian and Pashto, living in a war zone, and now to coding. What advice and tips do you have, now we're coming to the end, for the researcher into the pre-modern past and any student in general, in how to remain motivated and productive?
I think above all, the big game changers for me have all been perspective changes, I guess, rather than a particular app or a particular method or something like that, where you can get some kind of low to high single digits improvements in your ability to be effective from using Anki. Maybe Anki would be a little bit more than 10%, but you can have these incremental improvements. But having a mental shift, particularly around what you feel is possible, I think can be really important. and that can be in small to large scales. And I often find that reading about the lives of scholars in ages past, either 50 years ago to 1,000 years ago or something.
That's interesting. Do you have any examples of that, of biographies that you've read that kind of has inspired you?
Now that you've put me on the spot, I forget the title of it, for Lust of Enemies or something, or Robert Irwin's book on kind of Orientalism and kind of scholars. Even though that book raises all sorts of kind of questions and problems with kind of scholarship in years past, but just for me, realizing that people like A.J. Arbery and all of the people whose dictionaries we use for kind of studying kind of classical poetry and Janes and all of these people, Hans Ver.
Oh, there's issues there.
But all of these people, they really did work and were very conversant and kind of worked in 3-4 of these languages before they got to their mid-20s, early 30s, and just realizing that there was an expectation around that's a possibility, I think just is a really important, and was for me a really important reminder that thinking that Arabic need to be the only thing that you study, and you can only do this, and maybe if you study really hard you could only learn one language. I think that's just a baseline that we assume that's what's the case, whereas a few years ago there was a different normal and there was a different kind of expectation around what was possible. So that for me has been really important, just to realize that all sorts of things are possible.
But just on that point, on finding inspiration from past speakers, some people may actually be quite intimidated by that, or find fault with kind of institutional problems that they're not conversant in 4 languages in their mid-20s.
What do you mean institutional problems?
Schooling doesn't cater for people to kind of achieve these skills of proficiency, and even just teaching languages, or how to kind of have that mindset.
I would agree, and I mean that's kind of what we've been talking about, right? All of this time, that and I would say probably for a lot of these people, schooling was incidental to their success. They just they had an expectation for themselves that they would learn this stuff, and they worked on it, and they worked hard, and so on. Plus, there was far more of a memory of these kind of older ways of learning things that aren't really around now, and yeah, that's what we've been talking about, right? That you don't need a school to be able to do these things, and and in my work, the greatest compliment I can get from when I'm working with someone as a language coach is when that person I stop working with that person because I've made them self-sufficient, or they've made themselves self-sufficient, and any kind of education system which breeds dependence on that hand which feeds you, I think is something that you should be very wary about engaging with, because it's weakening your ability to be self-sufficient.
And what projects are you currently working on of interest to our listeners?
I am currently I do my language coaching work. I've just moved back to Pakistan, so I will be engaging with Urdu a little bit more, and there will at some point be a mastering Urdu coming out with my wife, and I still do some kind of occasional Afghanistan related research work, but one of my main focuses at the moment is adding a new skill of digital literacy into my kind of quiver in order to, for various reasons. But that's kind of what I'm focusing on at the moment. Giving myself the ability to use digital skills as a kind of a force multiplier.
Dr. Strick, thank you for speaking with Abbasid History Podcast.
Thank you for having me.